Breaking now on the outcome of the Alabama Senate race with a look at how the press covered it all. Howard Kurtz, host of MediaBuzz, writing, "It's not much of an overstatement to say that the media are enjoying the Alabama upset. It is, among other things, a great story, one that feels as much like a cultural movement or moment coming in the midst of a fierce national debate over sexual harassment as a political verdict." And there was the late-night drama of Doug Jones surging past Roy Moore in the final hour of vote counting, producing a Democratic victory that once might have been hard to imagine. Howard Kurtz joins us now. It did seem that the media did celebrate this as a victory a little differently than they did perhaps all the other major celebrities and political powerhouses whose careers came tumbling down. Is there a double standard?
Well, it was a great story, but imagine how different the tone would have been had Roy Moore surged in the final counting and beaten Doug Jones by 20,000 votes. I mean, I think part of this is that there was a collective judgment that Roy Moore was a bad guy and he wasn't fit to be a senator. But beyond that, the press played such a key role, Julie, in digging up those accusations by the 9 women of sexual harassment by the former judge back, nearly 4 decades ago. And Moore ran against the Washington Post, what he called the lynch mob media. He was kind of a Trumpian flavor to that. So I think that was factored in as well.
So basically, when we heard of John Conyers, Al Franken, Harvey Weinstein, Matt Lauer, Charlie Rose, all those stories were broken by the media, which is ironic that the media is in fact responsible for taking down these very high-profiled actors, television personalities, politicians. However, you didn't necessarily feel the same kind of celebration. It was a depressing story nonetheless, but it wasn't one that was exciting the media so much. Why then the celebrating of Roy Moore's fall yesterday?
Well, I mean, for one thing, when you talk about some of the media figures, many journalists reporting on the story, they know Matt Lauer, they know Charlie Rose. There was some mixed emotions there. But to be clear, I mean, it was the voters of Alabama who ultimately decided. It isn't the press that took him down, but I certainly would say the press played a key role. The other fascinating factor to me in looking at the coverage is the way in which many in the media trying to hang this defeat around President Trump's neck. Now, there's simply no question. He endorsed Moore, he did the robocall, and it was a setback for the president who wanted to preserve that seat. But at the same time, it's not just the liberal precincts of the media. For example, New York Times editorial page has a headline after Moore's defeat, "Sanity Reigns." But also, Julie, Wall Street Journal editorial page, National Review. This really split the Republican Party, and many conservative commentators were happy that Moore is not going to be the senator from
Here's
Alabama.
what I think is ironic, because while the media may have been celebrating Moore's loss, a Roy Moore win would have been a bad thing for Republicans in the end, and it would have been a bad thing for the GOP. So then that brings me back to my original point. Why then would the media celebrate Roy Moore's win when really it is a win for Republicans, despite the fact that a Democrat took that race away in Alabama?
Well, there was such high drama. It really had become a nationalized election. So if Roy Moore had won despite everything that was thrown at him, and by the way, he was a terrible candidate. He mostly didn't campaign, and when he did, he kept miring himself in new controversies. I think in the moment, the press felt that it was a better outcome, many in the press, I should say, that Roy Moore not become a United States Senator. But you are right, some of the more savvy analysts, if Roy Moore had won, first of all, there'd be months of battle with an ethics committee hearing. Would he be expelled? And the Democrats would have run against this guy through 2018. Every other Republican senator would have been described as a colleague of Roy Moore. The donors are supporting Roy Moore. So in a way, you could say that the Republican Party dodged a bullet. And even for President Trump, probably he loses the seat. He's got a 51-49 majority now in the Senate, but he doesn't have the Roy Moore as a continuing drumbeat of a story.
And there's also, there's this effort to blame President Trump for Roy Moore's loss, which let's just remember what has happened in Alabama, because he did also campaign for Luther Strange. Luther Strange lost in the primary. He ended up backing Roy Moore as a number 2, but that wasn't necessarily his first option. So the president campaigning for a candidate doesn't always mean that candidate's going to win. And that is not just for President Trump. That also applied to former President Obama. But for some reason, when the president sticks his neck out for a candidate now and that candidate doesn't win, it seems that there is a big pile on the president, showing that he has lost a lot of the power that he once wielded.
Right. I mean, Roy Moore lost that election. Donald Trump didn't lose the election. But certainly, even though he came to Roy Moore reluctantly, didn't back him in the primary, initially distanced himself, once he came out and endorsed and had that rally in Pensacola, it was going to be judged, according to the political scoreboard, as a win or a setback for President Trump. And the other thing the press tried to do is to say, and to badger, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, so the president doesn't believe these 9 women, does he? So the president is saying, what about the president's own accusers from the campaign? All of that got dredged up in what ordinarily would have been an easy win in the red state of Alabama.
Yeah, and let's also note, you just said it. I mean, he campaigned and he held that rally in Pensacola. He did not go to Alabama. Had he gone there, maybe different, but he did want to sort of distance himself as well. I think President Trump did something that we are all not catching on to. Perhaps he saw that this is where this was going, and he just did the right thing as a Republican president to back the Republican candidate. But anyway, Howard Kurtz, that is all the time we have. We appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much.
Good to see you.